It's January 16th, 2018, and tonight is a review of a book and sharing of a book that I did many years ago. I have the most wonderful job because I get to learn every day the things that I want parents and families to learn about, and it reminds me of it. And what surprises me about something like this is I went back over and listened to the broadcast I did on this book 8 years ago. In fact, I could hear my now 10-year-old child, when she was a year and a half years old, I could hear her crying in the background while I was broadcasting the webinar. And what was amazing to me was how many of the truths that I think about today are found in this book, that are at the heart of this book, and how those patterns that we look at many different authors, many different theories and approaches to parent education, how those themes show up over and over again in the work that I do. So it was really a fun time this week preparing for this webinar. I like this because I think it playfully, there's an image on the screen that I'm showing for those watching the webinar portion, and it shows a long battlefield. It shows a person on a horse in front and a huge army leaving, and the two soldiers at the front of the army are saying to each other, "I hear it's because we're right and they're wrong." And really what this is tonight, The Anatomy of Peace, is it's a book about finding peace in our hearts with other people. And most importantly, a fundamental principle that they talk about is this idea: it's not about the behavior. I'm going to give an example tonight of somebody from 900 years ago, a great leader of a military who was humane even in his leadership, and considered the best, most successful military person of his era. He was seen as somebody who had his heart at peace. He saw even his enemies as humane, as human people. He treated them humanely. So there's this idea about how we regard people and how we regard our children. The Anatomy of Peace is the prequel written for the book, the Leadership and Self-Deception. And it tells the story. It starts off with children getting dropped off at a fictitious wilderness program. And then the parents enter into this 2-day intensive, this 2-day educational process at the beginning. And so much of the skepticism, the anger, comes out in their stories as they're listening to these two leaders. The two leaders of this particular wilderness program, one is a Muslim and one is a Jew. And they, of course, have a heritage of being at war with each other. And through the use of history and through the use of their own cultural differences, they're able to describe how the core concepts in relationships are present, whether it's in a couple, a family, or even something so profound as a war. As the parents are arriving and the main characters are arriving, Lou and his wife, Carol, and their son, Corey, are arriving. Corey's been convicted of crimes related to substance abuse disorder and stealing and theft. And they're dropping him off, and Dad is bitter and angry and doesn't want to be there and doesn't see himself as part of the problem. Then there's another young woman by the name of Jenny who's come. She'd been tricked by her father, and she starts off the process running away from the counselors, and that's the backdrop of this setting. So they're sitting in this group room starting to learn. And essentially the two leaders talk about a change in the way that they talk about a sensibility, a way of being, a word that I often use. And initially they say most people come into therapy with an idea of changing the other. I joke about this idea that in couples therapy, and I've been doing couples therapy for 20 plus years, is that the underlying premise often in couples therapy is that couples show up and they are saying unconsciously, if not consciously, if you could just change this bozo over here, everything would be fine. And that most of the solutions that we see in our lives around conflict and in our family involve mostly other people changing, right? Our children getting better. And of course, the big shift in this book is the internal work that we do in relationship to the problem. You know, we talk about this idea in addiction work of codependency, this co-participation, this dance that we do, that to learn to extricate ourselves from that dance, to learn to focus on our own disease, we become a part of the solution. We become a part of helping. We stop intermittently reinforcing the behaviors and the patterns that we know are unhealthy. It's in the essence of the serenity prayer, right? The things that I can control and the things that I can't. The whole book is about shifting locus of control from external, that is, what happens in life, the facts or the facticity, that determines my success and my happiness, to how I deal with it, how I respond to it. It has the biggest impact on my peace, my serenity, my depression, my anxiety. So I've got to learn to change my relationship to others. I talk about this idea of Trojan horse therapy at Evoke. And then they do a good job of stating their own version of it in this book. You know, when the young girl Jenny is having a freak out about not going, Lou says to one of the counselors, you know, it's a rough day, and he says, yeah, some of the parents really struggle in this initial phase. And Lou is taken back because he's like, we're not struggling. Jenny, the teenager over there, is struggling. And the counselor's going to say, you know, we're really worried about you guys. We're really worried about the kinds of things that you need to do to make a change in the system. And although we have temporary stewardship over your children, you're going to have a lifelong relationship with your child. And I don't think it's a simple cause and effect, but going back into old systems, it's hard to maintain gains, right? You don't want to be part of the resistance to positive change. So this idea about the Trojan horse is that the gift is that we're going to fix your child, and we have a wonderful program that I believe in passionately. But after the gift is received, after the gift is let in, if you will, past the walls of the village, the walls of the town, then we as helpers, through the webinars, the assignments, the books, the phone calls, the parent coordinator, the parent portal, the podcasts, the parent groups, the parent workshops, we get out of the horse and we surround the family, the parents, and we do our work. And there's the great line from the play Wilderness that was out a couple of years ago that we hope will tour the country eventually, where one of our therapists is saying, you know, in essence, I hear parents say to me, essentially, you know, here's my kid, fix him, and when he's done, send him back to me. And I think the people that show up on these broadcasts, these webinars, these podcasts, the parents that get involved in our work at Evoke are not those parents. They're the ones that have begun to see the light, to see the wisdom, to see how possibly they might be contributing to the dynamic. And don't get in a hurry to get cured. Don't get in a hurry to get fixed. In fact, it's the parents that I work with who imagine themselves to be cured, who imagine themselves to be beyond it, are the ones that are most vulnerable to backsliding, most vulnerable to the kind of behavior that becomes a problem. Years ago, this is about 18 years ago, was a little long, no, it was longer than that. This is 23 years ago. I went to a workshop that was presented by the Arbinger Institute, the same folks who wrote this book. And it was for the Real Wilderness program. One of my professors was a parent teacher, and so my wife and I went. We might have had a young child at that time. We did, I suppose, but we weren't having problems. We just went there. And I remember sitting and listening to the lessons that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. And I remember thinking to myself, man, these are really, really good tools, really good skills, really good insights from my wife. She's going to get a lot out of this. And unbeknownst to me, my wife was sitting next to me thinking the same thing. These are really good lessons for Brad to be learning. So we left this 2-hour workshop, maybe 3-hour workshop. We got into our car to go home, and we had a fight with each other about the things that the other person needed to change. It was so ironic and so classic. But that's what people take away a lot from, you know, parent education, psychology, therapy sessions, is the answers, the application isn't to self, it's to other. What does my child need to listen to? What does my child need to learn? I remember doing a webinar some time ago about a book, The Letters of Juliet, which is all about this idea of looking at oneself, right? Stop looking at the other person to change. Make the transformation in you. In this book, the anatomy piece does a great job illustrating through a process the kind of transformation that can happen when an individual, father in this case, principally, seeks to get his heart to be at peace, even in in a situation where there's a lot of conflict and difficulty with his son. But most of the time, we don't take that in. So I'm doing this webinar on the letters of Juliet, and at the end of an hour long of making that point over and over again, one of the parents asks on the webinar the question, how do I get my child to see this? How do I get my child to look at themselves to see that they're part of the problem? And it demonstrates how ingrained that way of thinking is for us, right? We learn a new insight. We learn a new principle from Codependence Anonymous. We learn something from our therapy, and oftentimes our first instinct is to go home and share it with others to change them, instead of allowing that, which is much more of the difficult work, allowing that to bear fruit in us, to bear transformation in us. Self-deception is talked about in both the Anatomy of Peace and in the Leadership and Self-Deception book. And the fundamental self-deception is when we believe that we don't have a problem. It's not knowing that I have a problem, not knowing that I suffer from my own disease, my own mental health issue, and that it is worthy of my constant attention. And hope comes, like I said, it comes when we change our view, change our locus of control. Doesn't matter what relationship. They talk about it in this book as being at work. The second book is like I said, is the sequel that was written before. Actually, they were written out of order. But the second book is after Lou comes home and transforms his company and applies the principles to his company. This first book, it applies more specifically to family. This is where he first learned it. What do I do if this question at the parent meeting is really what will I do to stop it from happening or fix it once it happens, right? The question that I get so often from parents is, what do I do? How do I respond? What do I do if my child overreacts? What do I do if my child relapses? What do I do if my child runs? What do I do if my child berates me on a phone call? And the response is, you learn to do it differently. You learn to react differently. You don't try to prevent it. We don't work extra hard at guaranteeing that something won't go sideways. But we talk about how can you deal with it differently. How can you see it differently, which is going to lead you to dealing with it differently. And seeing it differently includes that mistakes are part of the growth process, that success is overvalued, that the detours and step backs are what people need to learn. I say just as often to my clients, my parents that I work with, I say just as often to them, are you ready for a change, as I would say to their children. And by the way, we give the same message to your children. We talk about, when we're talking to them, we're talking about them changing, not you changing. And believe me, they want to spend a majority of the time on you changing in many cases. The parent meeting really is about changing parent. The parent education that they talk about is changing the parent. Even though few people attend the meeting with the overt idea that they have dropped their children off to get them fixed when they come to the parent meeting, in this book and the parent meetings that we run, they come to the meeting looking for ways to control their children, change the behavior of the children, asking questions like, give me the steps, what is the guarantee? I had a client tell me recently this week that she was saying when she first got into this work and getting help for her daughter, she would say that she would ask people, what are the steps, right? What's the trajectory? Give me the blueprint, if you will. And she said the old timers, the ones that have been around a long time, would look at her at the parent meetings and the Al-Anon meetings that she would attend, and they would just smile kindly. And now that she's farther along in the processes, she realized that's not how it goes. You can't control this process. So they introduced this idea of two areas of focus. They call it the change pyramid. And they talk about how much time we spend focusing on things that are going wrong. We nag, we berate, we coach, we're frustrated, we lecture, we pay attention to. It becomes our focus. And we get over-involved in the negativity. We increase this dynamic, this pattern, where we're nagging, we're criticizing, and the other person is angry and upset. And instead of trying to focus on the positive, the strength-based piece of it. I'll talk a little bit about this more in detail as we go along. but they separate and say that we need to spend more time on the positives. In this book, more than the other book, they talk about how our change can lead to an effective invitation into somebody else changing. They don't do that in the other book as much. So I won't invite my child to change if my interaction with him are primarily in order to get him to change. It is such an irony, right? We have to hold on loosely. We have to make invitations. We have to detach. We have to be neutral. We have to take a step back. We make invitations and we lead out. And sometimes we go to the meetings even when they don't come. I have parents ask me all the time about their co-parent or their spouse if I'm doing more couples-focused therapy. What do I do to get him or her to come to therapy? And I say, you invite them gently. And if they don't want to come, then you go by yourself. You go to that Al-Anon meeting yourself, or that parent meeting yourself, or that therapy session yourself. And you expand your capacity. He talks about this idea in the book. They talk about this idea that we're all surrounded by autonomous people who don't always behave as we like. It's kind of a humorous thing to say and rather obvious on its face. But I talk about that in the field all the time with the kids. Sometimes there'll be a very difficult student in the group that is really trying for the rest of the students and the clients. And I'll make the joke. I'll say something like, well, I didn't want to tell you this, but that student, that client is not really a client or a student at Evoke. That student or client is actually a staff member. We hire them. They look really young, but we hire them to come in and act out to teach you something, to teach you what you have to learn. Same thing with me in the group is the great gifts that my most oppositional, resistant clients have given me over the years. I oftentimes have overtly thanked them because I say, I had this idea that I can manipulate, control everybody, and you're reminding me that I can. And I'll name it in the moment. Sometimes when children come home for transitioning home, when they come home for a home visit, maybe a phone call, aftercare, maybe it's program after program after program, the lesson is still in there for the parent. I will, when I have a good relationship, I'll tease the parent and say, we told your child to relapse. I'll let them in on the joke very quickly, but I'm trying to illustrate, what's the lesson? What's the takeaway? That's what's more valuable in this than the success in and of itself. And as a father, I know the trappings of wanting to focus on the success so much. The example they give from approximately 900 years ago is from a great warrior leader. I don't know if I'll pronounce his name perfectly, but it's Saladin. He was an Islamic warrior, and he showed great compassion. He did a lot of interesting things. He would show compassion toward the enemy. He would send the enemy at times with a guard so the enemy wouldn't be hurt. In certain situations, if they were trying to rescue a spouse, or one woman came to him begging for her child who had been taken from her tent in the middle of the night, and she was told to go to the Muslim king, and that the Muslim king would show compassion. And the story goes that Saladin wept with tears and went and found the young girl that had been stolen, who was at the slave market, and returned her to his mother. When they had a treaty at the end, he gave what some of his own people said was much too much money to those that he released, and he required much too less of a ransom for those that he was turning over. And so he showed a compassion, and they contrasted that with other warriors and leaders and armies and how ruthless they were, plundering and raping and all kinds of devastating atrocities. And they said even in as stark of an example as a war, you can show that your heart is at peace. You can treat the enemy as a human, which he tried to do. There's a great quote in here as they're illustrating this, and Lou, the main character, is arguing with the idea about being right, being on the right side of things. And what the leader of the group says, he says, if you're not wrong, then you'll be willing to consider how you might be mistaken. And I think that might be the simplest thing. The more confident I become, what I say is, the more that I know I am okay in a situation, the more I'm willing to look at my mistakes, the more I'm willing to look at my contribution to the problem. But needing to be good, and I'll talk about that a little later because they do a great job of explaining in this book, needing to be seen as good or needing to be good is the enemy of being open to this process. I tell this story. I've been a Lakers fan my whole life, and I think this is in my book, in fact, about Kobe and Shaq. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a battle on the Lakers about whose team it would be. They were several years apart, had different personalities, different styles, and they were always kind of battling. And it was famous in the media and around sports for this feud to be talked about for several years, even though they had some success. And I was listening to Magic Johnson, who at the time owned part of the Lakers and was a commentator on this feud between them. And Magic, being the great leader that he was, said, "I'll know whose team it is when that person comes forward and defers to the other person." In other words, if Kobe comes forward and says, "It's Shaq's team, Shaq, I'm behind you," then I'll know it's really Kobe's team. And if Shaq comes forward and says, "Kobe, I'm behind you, I'm supporting you, I got your back," then I'll know that it's Shaq's team. That what comes along with that confidence, with that clarity of self, that heart at peace, is that you're able to look at your faults, your flaws, your humility. You're able to follow. You're able to not be right, to not be in charge. My wife said to me years ago, when we were dating, she says, when I was in one of my moods, my arguments with her, she said, "You might be right, but you're going to be alone." And that has stuck with me all these years. I think about it in terms of aftercare choices. When clients get to the place where they say, "I'm open. My best thinking got me here. The most important attribute of my next placement, my next setting, is me. That's the thing that's going to determine my happiness." Versus when they make all kinds of demands and entitlements and start describing the perfect setting. The way that we leak when we're trying to be right, we justify, right? We have to prove our point. We kind of make a ledger of points. We cite other people. We recruit experts. We sometimes recruit the mysterious they. Sometimes we just use shame in our tone. Who think, my famous thing around the family is I'll say things when I'm being shaming. My family tells me I say this. I'll say, "Who does that? Who thinks like that?" And it's so obvious when it's repeated back to me that it's absolutely shaming. We try to prove our point. We try to argue. We try to make the other person wrong, right? Because in the equation, if I'm right, then you're wrong, versus just being ourselves. It's that contrast that I talk about in the book, where the myth of being right, where you just get to be yourself. You don't have to kick your son out of the house and prove that smoking pot and playing video games is unhealthy. You just get to say, "I'm not comfortable with it." You're allowed to say that. Unfortunately, that kind of strength is born upon having been valued as a child similarly growing up, and many of us had less than ideal upbringings in that way. To contrast the heart of peace and at war, I think it's very simply illustrated by these two charts that they draw in the book. For the heart of peace, we see others as people. We see their hopes, their needs, their cares, and their fears as real to ourselves as they are to them. And I think at times of children, we talked about this with a recent book, we dehumanize children. We make them less than. The heart at war sees others as objects, obstacles, vehicles, irrelevancies. We see them as something to be manipulated and controlled, buttons to be flipped, switches to be flipped. We see them as reflection of us, as extensions of us. All of those are ways of talking about somebody as an object instead of a human. The philosopher Martin Buber's idea of it's the I-it versus the I-thou relationship. And it's hard to have an I-thou relationship with somebody who has hurt you. We want to turn them into a thing. We want to vilify them, right? We want to hurt them back or manipulate them back. So this takes depth and work to see the other person as a thou. It also need not compromise our boundaries. I think one thing that they actually miss in this book, and I'll just comment on this here, I think that they talk about if we see people as ourselves. That's the heart of peace. I don't think we see ourselves as human, oftentimes. In other words, I think it's more of a thou-thou relationship that is the ideal, right? That I'm allowed to take care of me, that I matter, and that you're the same. I think at times the I-thou kind of thinking sounds like, looks like, I'm important and therefore, and also you're important, instead of we're just both okay, we're just both human. And I matter and you matter, and there's absolutely no hierarchy. So it might be a little distinction there, but the value is about seeing people and their needs as relevant as mine, versus seeing them as an extension of us, as objects needing to change for our satisfaction, right? That it's our children's job to get well so that we're not anxious, so that we're not upset. We hand that over to them. Behavior is not the measure of objectification. Our heart of view of people is the only measure of objectification. They illustrate this point very much, and I talk about this a lot. It's not the behavior that determines whether you're doing something from a loving place. And people can sense and feel if it comes from a place of love. The behavior doesn't reveal where the heart is. Right? You can act towards somebody in a very similar way behaviorally and not do it from a place of love. And like I always talk about, if you do it from a place of love, it's almost impossible to get it wrong. And if you do it from a place of fear, anxiety, control, anger, it's almost impossible to get it right. And they use the example of the Saladin, the great warrior leader, and about how his behavior was on some measure similar to other leaders, but that it was the heart that made him different inside. Our children, of course, don't want to be objects. They do care how and if we see them. It matters to them, and they can feel it. And then oftentimes we'll turn our children and others into caricatures, two-dimensional people, when they frustrate us or upset that, to justify our anger, to justify our upset feelings. They talk about and present this idea of collusion in the book, that we collude with each other to create a scenario that is unending. We get frustrated and upset, and then we look for information to justify that frustration, anger, and upsetness. And then the other person participates in that dance with us. We demoralize the other person when we feel guilty. Demonize the other person when we feel guilty. We vilify them. They give examples of couples asking for chores and favors of each other, and the other person feeling put out, and then making that other person a nag or something horrible so that they don't have to do it because they're feeling guilty. We eventually invest and invite others to continue to be monsters so we can be justified in our view of them by extension of our feelings. And there's some great examples. This book is a hard one to give review because a lot of it's about stories. There's some really good stories. If you haven't read this book, it's one that I strongly recommend that you pick up. And I think it's so relevant to parents who have children or who have had children in the wellness therapy program that it'll speak to you very easily. So the stories that they give of these kinds of examples really do hit home. We escalate this conflict by gathering allies, like I mentioned earlier. In some theories, it's called recruiting. We use professionals. Here's what Brad says. Here's what the therapist says. So often I've heard people quote me, often misquote me, in fact, to make a point or to be right. Instead of, again, just standing on their own ground and saying, this is what I feel and this is what I believe, this is my truth. We use friends. We use the like I said, the amorphous they. We can use research. I talk about the dad and the marijuana question in this example, right? Where the father didn't have a sense that him saying what he felt with regard to, he had to prove to his son harmful effects of marijuana, like I mentioned a few minutes ago. Self-betrayal and war. Reality therapy is a theoretical stance in therapy that suggests that happiness and real peace comes from inside of oneself. There are few things so painful as contempt for others, from others. Few things except one. As painful as it is to receive contempt from another, it is more debilitating by far to be filled with contempt for another. So again, it is what we feel that determines our happiness, and that is our responsibility. People don't cause that in us. It's like that old adage of resentment being like a poison that we drink, hoping and expecting others to suffer. Right? That our hatred is our punishment. That our unkind feelings is our punishment. You know, we always think about that, like, well, I hope that person gets his or gets hers. But the answer is they are. If you have a heart at war, you're not at peace. You're already getting the reward. You're already getting the consequence. The choice to betray oneself is the cause of bitterness, not the events of our life. This is what philosophers, existentialists call facticity. That it is not the facts of our life that determine our happiness, but rather how we learn to cope with them and deal with them, with the meaning that we make out of them, the story that we write out of the pages that we're given, the letters that we're given. They talk about this foundational thing that we move our way up through this peacemaking pyramid. First of all, we have to get out of the box. We have to realize that we're part of the problem. We have to realize that we have a disease. We have to realize that we have an issue. We have to realize that we're contributing to the problem. Yes, there are genetics. Yes, there are other traumas. Yes, there are experiences in our child's life. Yes, there are our child's choices. But it doesn't do us a lot of good to focus on a lot of that. I remember years ago I was talking to a family at transition, at our graduation. And I was saying, when you go home, to the three of them, expect that nobody else in the family has changed. Just kind of set your mind to that. And then ask yourself, what am I going to do? If I believe that to be true, what's my response? And it was very difficult. The family had a hard time listening to me. They thought I was accusing them of not making progress. I said, no, it's just a mindset that helps. It doesn't help to focus on what the other people are and aren't doing right or wrong, to spend any kind of significant energy on it. We also build relationships after we get out of the box. We build relationships with people who have influence over others, like their friends, like the music they listen to, right? We try to understand where they're coming from, to get into their world. We build that relationship. We listen and learn to our children. I've said this 15 times this week. I say it 50 times every week with family. What you learn to do in terms of listening is much more important to shaping and encouraging healthy change in your children than the things that you say to them, the things that you teach them. Your openness is much more. And then, of course, there's a little bit of teaching and communicating. Then there's the correct behavior. But the foundation, right, the vast majority of the energy is on self-work. That top part of the pyramid is the least amount of time and energy we spend on this process, which I think a lot of us flip that upside down. Styles of justification, or being in the box, as they call it, that I'm better than you. I'm better than my children. I'm better than my wife in this situation, right? That idea that somehow I'm better than. I deserve more respect. I deserve something back. I deserve to be given a break. I deserve extra. This must be seen as, I think this is probably the most insidious one, the one that's the most unnatural to break free of, that the idea that in order to become a more enlightened parent, one has to accept that one is an idiot parent. That to be a more enlightened person, one has to be able to look at one's faults and failings and mistakes more courageously, more easily, even have a sense of humor with them. So if I must be seen as a certain way by my child, by others, it's going to get in the way of authenticity, of love, of kindness, of service, of generosity, of patience, all of those things. And then, of course, a worse than. Just so we cover that it's not, when I talk about being an idiot parent, it's not from a beating yourself up. It's from a place of it's like saying I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes. And I'm going to pick myself up after each one of them. And I'm going to say I'm sorry. But not, the answer isn't in I'm great or I'm horrible. The answer is in I'm human. That's why when I hear people talk about therapy, especially around parent education, they're trying to convince themselves that they're good or not, or decide if they're bad or not. That's the wrong equation. The fact of the matter is your children had the unfortunate circumstance of being born to a human that has wounds and limitations and symptoms and issues. And that if they're lucky, that parent will turn that into a product for themselves. The steps of creating inner peace for oneself. Look at the signs of the box. Look at the signs of blaming, justification, catastrophizing things. Understand that the common ways that we justify to try to make ourselves feel good about ourselves in a challenge, in a circumstance. Find an out-of-the-box place. Find out-of-the-box relationships. Ideally a therapist or a 12-step meeting. Maybe you can remember a time when you felt love and compassion, even when somebody, quote-unquote, didn't deserve it. Places in your life, situations, relationships in your life where you felt that. Ponder the situation from anew, from this out-of-the-box perspective. Start to think about it in these ways. For example, what are the person's challenges, trials, burdens, and plans? How am I or some group of which I'm a part of adding to these challenges, trials, burdens, and pains? In what ways have I mistreated this person? In what ways are my box styles interfering with the solutions? What am I feeling I should do for this person? And then the fourth step is act upon what I have discovered. I want to say this very, very clearly because I think it's important. This creating inner peace 4-step process in step 3 has several principles involved. Is what it means to be a courageous parent, a heroic parent. You know, when I work with families, and I've been working with them for many years now, and families make the turn and they show up on these podcasts and they show up in these sessions, they show up at our parent support groups, and they're just looking at themselves. And then they've learned to start to do battle with and let go of their guilt so they can show up. They've learned to take the sting out of blame, the shame out of blame. They've learned to see where they're wounded. They themselves are dented, and they in turn dent their children. And they can work on it. They can apologize. They can keep trying. When parents start to do that, my thought is that's the most wonderful gift that a parent can give to a child. And it changes everything. So creating this inner peace, what this book talks about, is that shift. So here are some of the take-home lessons from the book. Most of the time and effort should be spent on the lower levels of the pyramid, right? Our way of being, getting out of the box, thinking of other people like us as important as we are, their needs, pains, challenges, and so forth. The solution to a problem at one level of the pyramid is always below that level of the pyramid. In other words, if you're looking at the top of the pyramid, I'll go back to it, and you're thinking about correcting, the solution to correcting behavior is teaching and communicating. If you're having a problem with teaching and communicating, you need to listen and learn more. If you have a problem listening and learning, you build the relationship, right? And then at the very bottom, you go back to the core, which is learning to get out of the box. These hard work kinds of ways of being. Ultimately, my effectiveness at each level of the pyramid depends upon the deepest level of the pyramid, my way of being. My take home, what I take away from it. Read the books. Read The Anatomy of Peace, Leadership and Self-Deception. They're great books. You can listen to them on audio. They go fairly fast. Like I said, these are two harder books because they're not just a step-by-step explanation, but they're stories. And stories are a little bit harder to give in a review, and I do highly recommend them. I quote them in my book. So I have a lot of faith in them. Attend 12-step meetings. We ask you to attend 6 12-step meetings. Just try to get something out of it. Try to hear what they're learning. Try to hear from the other people that are in relationship with people who have substance abuse issues and disorders. What are they learning? How are they trying to be with those people? There's a great story in this book that touches me. I hope not to ruin it, but it's a powerful story about Lou when he was younger and how his dad was out of the box with him. They were a very poor family and had an old truck for many years, and finally saved up enough money to buy a new truck. And so Lou, being a teenager, said, "Can I take the new truck into town, Dad? I need to go into town. I want to show all the kids. I'm so proud of the truck." And his dad said, "Sure." Gave him the keys. Lou went out to the truck and remembered that he forgot something, and he came back in, grabbed it. When he came back out to the truck was gone. And it terrified him. He was horrified. And he noticed down at the end of the road on this farm that they lived on that there were fresh tracks that were leading into the river, and the new truck was sinking into the river. And as he was watching that, he was absolutely just struck with terror. His father had made this great sacrifice. They weren't rich, and this new truck, he had ruined it. And so he walked back in beside himself and said to his father, "You know, Dad, I've done the most horrible thing. I left the parking brake off, and the truck has rolled back down to the river." And his father said to him, "Well, you might as well take the old truck keys then, because you're going to need to get into town some way." And Lewis talked about how that changed him forever, how that left an impact on him. And so sometimes it's the thing that we might perceive as a weakness that really is a strength, that shows us that it's our greatest ability to demonstrate love, that makes the biggest difference to somebody. I remember when my son did something very similar. We had a boat back in the day, and it's the first time I think he was pulling the boat himself, and I was really worried about it. He was 17 or so, and I was giving him directions, and remember, you have this boat behind you, and don't forget. And he was like, yeah. And I turned around and I walked back toward the front door of the house, and by the time I got to the front door, I heard this large crashing sound, and he had turned sharp around, leaving our driveway. There was a stone wall there, and he had crushed it, and the boat was sitting up on its edge. And there was insurance, but several $1,000s worth of damage to our property. And I remember thinking that he can't feel more horrible about this. There's no way that anything I could say could make it feel horrible. And so I said, "Man, we got to get a picture of this, because this is amazing. Nobody's going to believe this." And we talk about this to this day. It was a moment when the correct thing wasn't important. Being right wasn't important. Remember, this is your journey. Don't lose track of that. You have your own project. Your codependency, your relationship issues, your mental health is the focus. And that's the best way to impact your child. Own your stuff. Practice the communication. Practice listening. And do your work. By the way, the young girl that I mentioned at the beginning of the book, that they mentioned at the beginning of the book, Jenny, they had an exercise about how to deal with her, because she didn't want to go in. She took her shoes off. It was in Arizona. Her feet were being blistered. And the staff came up and they offered her shoes, and she rejected their shoes, but the staff took off their shoes anyway. And they sat with her. They sat with her in her pain. They sat with her in the hole that she was in. They sat with her as equals. Even though she wouldn't take the shoes, they took the shoes off their feet, even though it was blistering hot outside, just to be with her. And so we don't necessarily pull our children up to where we are. We get in it with them. We get under the bus with them. We get in the hole with them. We sit beside them, and we offer them the comfort of our presence, our humanness, our being with them. Paul Goddard said, one of our therapists said, we lose our ability to influence our children when we try to control them. I used to have this slide at the end of every presentation for years, because in the first 3 or 4 years, it happened a lot more than it does now. Parents would listen to me and would feel guilty. I would say, "Oh, I've made so many mistakes." So I would have this slide where I would say it's not cause and effect, right? That the outcome of healthy parenting is its own reward. That healthy parenting doesn't produce well-behaved children. That healthy parenting produces peace and serenity and meaningfulness and quality of life for the parent. And that can then have a wonderful impact on the child. And this idea that it's cause and effect is the very nature of objectification, right? If I can change you, if I can control you, you by some definition become an object. I remove the element of choice and agency and autonomy, like I described earlier. Be careful of moving from disconnected and unaccountable to accountable for too much. right? It's finding this balance. That's why the words like dance and pattern and cycle are important, because those don't have a certain kind of punctuation to them. There's not a beginning and an end, a cause and an effect. It's a co-participation. And by looking at it in that non-punctuated way, we can strip away some of the guilt, the anxiety, and the shame. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions or comments. The peacemaking pyramid has been the most important thing I took away from this book. I thought my role of a parent was to correct and to teach. I had no context about the bottom 2 steps of the pyramid. My son's residential treatment center uses this book as the basis of their program. Also, the work of getting out of the box is something I have only been able to improve by doing my own work. It has been hard and continues. Thanks for the review and the reminders. Thank you for that. Again, I'm challenged by this book. I hope this particular webinar, this particular podcast, more than anything, is an invitation to look at a great resource, because I do think this is a great resource, great philosophy, great story. Next comment, question. What if one parent has read the books, attends meetings, and is making progress, but the other parent is not? Do you think the influence of the other parent, of one parent on the rest of the family, can be enough to initiate change? Yes. The research shows that children need at least one person, in their life to be in this role, to have a positive effect, and to mitigate against life's traumas. It's better if there's 2. It's better if it's everybody. But one person can make a difference. You know, to be clear, to emphasize this, the person who's made the biggest difference in my life is my therapist. She's 76 years old. She's not my mother. I've only known her for 19 years, and I go and visit with her for 1 hour a week. So if 1 hour a week with my therapist can, for me, make a profound impact on me, then of course having one parent do it differently can make a big difference. And it is a long game. You might not see it in the short run, but it can make a difference. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for asking that. All right, I'll go to the upcoming questions, and if there are any others, we can do it at the end. Like I said, please go to 6 12-step support groups, Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI.org to find resources and free classes in your area. Share our podcasts, share them on social media, share them with your friends. All of these broadcasts are available via the podcast app on your iPhone. Search Evoke Therapy Programs there, or on your Android device or on a PC, you can download the SoundCloud app or go to the SoundCloud page and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. On Facebook, search us at Evoke Therapy Programs. Find the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook, and of course, go to our blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If you don't have one, go out and buy it. Also, if you read it and you want to leave me a review, I'd be happy to have your review on Amazon. You can also listen to it on audio through Audible or by buying CDs. The next workshop will be January 20th and 21st at Cascades. We have a couple of Entrada ones up there, so if you can possibly go to it, sign up for it. It's coming right up. If it fits in line with your therapist's opinion about a visit, you can combine any of these visits. We like all parents to go to the workshops, if you can, during your child's stay. These are not for alumni, but for during the process. You can also contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information, or to RSVP. The next Finding You is February 7th through 11th. We just finished another successful Finding You. If you want to do deeper work, some of the origins of some of the stuff that I talked about tonight, you can do a Finding You at our new Summit Lodge in Park City, Utah. A wonderful new location. So the next one is February 7th through 11th. To find out more, go to our website. We also have Finding Family for private families. If you want to do family work, go to intensives, email intensives at evoketherapy.com for more information, or go to our website. Our next parent support group, I'll be in New York on Monday at 7 to 9 at the City University of New York in Midtown. And then I'll be in Los Angeles on the 11th. We're also going to do, we'll have a couple of dates for Seattle and for Portland coming up here. Email Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information, or to RSVP for the groups. Pursuits trips are our adventure trips for young adults or families. I'm happy to answer any other questions that have come up. Next question. If you are not seeing change in your child, is it safe to say that you yourself as a parent have not done enough of your own work? I don't know if that's true or not. That's a great question. I like the humility of that question. I would say it's almost as if you're just not taking stock of their change. It's just not your priority to take stock of their change. It doesn't become something you're constantly assessing or asking. It's too simple to say it's a simple cause and effect. But my response is, it's not even the object of my focus, ideally. The minute I become focused on, obsessed with, preoccupied by how well they are or aren't doing, I have lost the focus. So that's kind of the shift, is a shift to taking more stock on a daily basis of how you're doing, not them. And to hold their progress, for better or for worse, lightly. Right? To have less and less of an opinion about it. And to have a mindset of, they might not be ready yet, or gosh, they might have to be going through something hard. But it's really to focus less, to even consider their change, positive or negative, even less is what I would say. Next parent says, I'm so angry at how my husband deals with situations with my son. I feel like I'm trying my best, but he cancels me out. How should I deal with this? I would say go to this book. Read this book if you haven't. There's also a webinar and a podcast on co-parenting. It's so hard to stay on your side of the street when somebody is sabotaging and working against you. No doubt about it. But you're going to need extra support. You're going to need extra classes, extra books, extra support groups to not have your anger and frustration with him become now your problem. Right? That's the key. If your resentment and anger and frustration with him gets in you, right, festers in you, then you become part of the problem. So you change. It's a practice. You change your focus. And you get extra support, like I said, in therapy, so that you can develop more compassion for your struggling husband, for your struggling wife, if it's a wife or a mother, or a husband or a father. But it's so easy to get trapped in the resentment. And I don't doubt that he's working at cross purposes with you. That's not the point or not. So this book helps. The co-parenting book helps. I think it can help in this process too. So, and I'm sorry you're dealing with that. All right, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. The fact that you're here is a testament to you trying to get out of the box. I appreciate and respect it. I know how hard it is to stay out of the box. I found myself in the box today more than once with other people in my life. I'll decide the next topic tomorrow. It'll be Thursday, this Thursday evening at 7 p.m., January 18th. Have a great couple of days, and I'll talk to you in 48 hours. Take care. Bye-bye.